Hello, everybody. Thank you very, very much for joining the next episode of Chosen Links. I am Boaz Hepner, and it's an honor to have each of you here, and I truly mean it, unlike many other times when I just say that because I'm Hollywooding it. You guys, actually, it's an honor to speak to. Since October 7th, it has been hell on earth for most Jews and Jewish allies around the world, and certainly even more hell on earth for people who live in the region. Jews and no doubt Palestinians and no doubt Christians and Muslims who live there. I'm sure it has been just utter hell. And I say that as somebody who lives from the safety of Los Angeles, but has family there. All of you have been asked to be on for something that really is touched on here and there, and you've each been interviewed in your own ways. But what I haven't seen and what most people haven't seen is a really nice collaborative way to get your minds together and talk about the crucial topic that is fact-checking, or as Gil Hoffman over here's name of the agency is very straightforward about, is honest reporting, because that's really what we're looking for. It's frustrating to everybody in the world when we know with just utter obviousness that there is such an amount of media bias, and to a lesser extent, people are aware of things that are algorithm management and confirmation bias and all of these things that add up along with the new advent of AI, which is why Shira Eisenberg is on. There's so many things that contribute to bias, in addition to, things like Qatar money going into colleges and all sorts of other elements we can sprinkle in there. At the end of the day, I'm 45 years old. I've grown up my whole life knowing, oh, when the New York Times reports on Israel, blah, 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 But when the Wall Street Journal reports on Israel, it's less blah, blah, blah. And nowadays, it's more of a conversation of, oh my goodness, what's happening with TikTok is disgusting because of blah, blah, blah. And what's happening with Instagram is less bad than TikTok, but it's also problematic because of blah, blah, blah. And as we try to adapt to all of these technologies, and as we try to adapt to the world changing, I think we've all noticed that people who used to be here and throughout my lifetime have become more here have now sort of become, just imagine my arms were as far as they could reach off screen, because that's what seems to be happening. People who gravitated to the left seem to be gravitating to more than I don't even want to call it the left anymore, right? They've gone outside of the zone of left, right? Liberal democracy, which I've always considered myself a social liberal Democrat, have now become socialists, Marxists. And people on the right, I've always considered myself, conservative. I've always respected people on both sides, Democrats, Republicans. If they were somewhat moderate, reasonable, I've always considered it as reasonable as could be. I voted for Bush. I voted against Bush. I voted for Obama. I voted against Obama. You are finding somebody who is literally middle of the road, always making a new decision based on what's presented in front of him. And for the sake of lack of alienation, I will not say who I will be voting for next time, but trust me, you know. And then you're all welcome to say it. But then what's happening with the right is it's gone far, far, far to the right, where I don't even recognize it anymore. To some degree, it's become what you can call alt-right. And it's this horseshoe theory that I've learned about more recently, where all of a sudden we see the people who are so far on the right and so far on the left are attending the same rallies. We saw that during COVID, when I was a COVID educator, and suddenly all of these hippy-dippy liberal people on the left who were always anti-vax were suddenly at the same marches with the people who were alt-righters that were anti-COVID vaccine. And people with Israel, we know what's happened. They're at the same rallies too. It's bizarro world, to sort of paraphrase Seinfeld. So it's what leads us to needing to have this conversation. People are not interested to hear what I have to say. They are interested in what you have to say, and I am interested in what you each have to say. So we're going to have a great conversation today where I'm going to talk to you. Readers and followers are going to talk to you. I have plenty of questions ready to go. And you are hopefully going to talk to each other. So before I get to you, I'm going to introduce you. So thank you for being here today. I will go in order of the screens that I am seeing in front of me to make it very easy and unbiased to start. So first, in my upper left corner, I see Olga Deutsch. Olga Deutsch is a sought-after global expert with extensive expertise in international politics and Europe-Israel relations. Before joining NGO Monitor, Olga held senior positions in the private sector in Europe and Israel. Her pro bono work includes co-founding the Europe Forum, a leading platform for bringing together civil society organizations in Israel and Europe, and serving as a member of the executive of the World Zionist Organization. Olga is a regular contributor to Israeli and international publications and a frequent commentator in the media. Thank you for being here today, Olga, from a vacation, no less.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure, truly. And the reason Olga's muted right now is not because she's trying to silence the rest of us. It's because she doesn't want us to hear the noise of her family. Moving on to my upper right corner, I'm looking at David Collier. David Collier is a well-known investigative journalist who has been arguing Israel's case for over 2 decades. I'm going to start that over because I don't want to stumble over his introduction. David Collier is a well-known investigative journalist who has been arguing Israel's case for over 2 decades. Having spent some time undercover posing as an anti-Israel activist, Collier has won awards for his journalism from the Al Jazeera as one of the J100, the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life, and the media watchdog Camera Portrait of Courage Award. Since October 7th, he has been battling back against the horrific media bias and the relentless demonization campaign we are seeing on our screens. And thank you, David, for joining us from my parents' homeland of England.
Well, thank you for having me, but I'm actually currently in all about ancestors' homeland because I'm in Tel Aviv. But there you go.
See, and that was the first fact checking there. That was a test. I knew he was in Israel. He passed the test. Otherwise, I was about to boot him off. So thank you for proving your worth. All right. Next, in my lower left corner, I am looking at Shira Eisenberg, who may be the only one talking to me from the United States. Shira is the founder of a stealth AI startup and has AI research and engineering experience at MIT, Intel, and the CDC. Her current startup specializes in trending narrative detection and response using AI on TikTok data. She was born in Israel, but grew up in New York and is currently living near Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us, Shira.
Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. And you're in Washington, D.C.? That part was correct?
Yes.
Okay, very nice. Next, I have right below me, I have my buddy, Eitan Fischberger. Eitan is a Middle East analyst and social media intelligence expert who focuses on uncovering terror ties within American media and NGO sector. His work has been featured in leading outlets including The Hill, Newsweek, Tablet Magazine, National Review, and many more. And although it's not part of his bio he gave me, I will point out that his grandfather is one of the most influential, fantastic rabbis in the entire world, Rabbi Avi Weiss over in Riverdale, and happens to be my rabbi's mentor, and it's a cool honor to have him. And none of his bio explains the real reason why he's on here, which we're going to get to, which is the UNRWA story, which he had beyond a huge impact in breaking. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Are you in Israel?
Yes, sir. And so is my grandfather. I'll send him your regards.
Ah, lovely. Very nice. You can give the man who doesn't know me my regards.
I always do.
And then, last but certainly not least, in my lower right corner, I am looking at Gil Hoffman, the one person in this chat who I've had the pleasure of giving a hug to and meeting in person. Gil Hoffman is the executive director and executive editor of the pro-Israel media watchdog HonestReporting. He teaches international communications at Israel's College of Management and is a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, where he served as chief political correspondent and analyst for 24 years. He is the only speaker in history to have lectured about Israel in all 50 states, even Hawaii? Really? Holy cow. That's kind of amazing. I give you
My wife even came with me to Hawaii. For some reason, she wanted to go there after she didn't come with me to Idaho.
That reminds me a lot of when my wife was working for Magen David Adom before she worked for Sheba. And when she went to her various places, I didn't join, but when she went to Alaska and to Hawaii, yep, I was on those trips. Gil, thank you so much for talking to us today. Most of you are talking to me from Israel, which means it's 9:15 p.m. And by the time we finish tonight, it will be quite late. So I appreciate it and let you lead the way on that. Olga, I don't have no idea what the time difference is where you are, but I know it's got to be the evening somewhere over there.
It's just 1 hour earlier than Israel, so it's evening.
All right, got it. And then Shira is 3 hours ahead of me, so she's fine. So thank you all for being here. That's the end of the bios, and it's time for you all to start talking. So my first question is actually not getting into the thick of it yet, but All of you, do all of you to some degree know each other, or is this are you guys newbies to each other? I'm guessing that there's some combination of both for all of you. Yeah.
I've been following everyone's work for a long time. I had the pleasure of working with Olga in the past at NGO Monitor, and Shira does amazing work with AI. So it's a big honor to be here and to meet everyone in this capacity. And of course, you as well, Boaz.
Oh, yes, naturally.
Yeah, obviously.
I think that the community of people doing what we do is so small, and the community of people who do what we do very well is even smaller. So even if we don't know each other in person, I most certainly heard of everyone on this call. But I have had a pleasure of working with Eitan and Gil very often, and our work, and David, with your work, it intertwines on regular basis, but it's an immense pleasure to be part of this conversation with all of you.
That's awesome. Shira, have you been able to meet anybody in your AI work, or you just follow people online, I'm guessing?
I follow people online, and I've had some conversations with Eitan and David, I think actually around when I was first starting off my current company. And it was focused primarily like on narratives that were anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian on TikTok, and analyzing those with AI. And so I had initially reached out to a couple of people to kind of get some feedback and to see if this is something that would be useful. And my company has grown in a lot of different ways, to the point where right now we're not only continuing with the Israel dashboard, but we're servicing like brands and content creators who are trying to monitor different areas in social media and different areas on TikTok. And I'll be honest, the only reason we went that direction is because it's a bit more lucrative. There's less money in monitoring just the Israel situation. And I had to consider that as a company. But I'm still really passionate about the work that I do with monitoring anti-Israel and anti-Semitic narratives on TikTok, and a lot of the stuff that I found there that has been kind of appalling, but eye-opening.
Well,
I had the pleasure of watching some of the videos that Shira uploaded of her software, I guess you'd call it, or her system in action, and it's pretty unbelievable. I don't know if we're gonna get to talk about it or not, but everyone should go check out Shira's work.
I definitely would love to, and
Unbelievable.
I've given all of you sharing capabilities. So if any of you have something you want to physically show me, including you, Shira, you are absolutely welcome to during this. And even if we're a little slow to it, we can always edit that in for later. But I'm happy to have you guys show me something.
I don't have the Israel dashboard quite ready today, but and I don't think that you guys would want to see a dashboard for a rapper or for a brand, but otherwise I would have loved to demo the Israel dashboard for you. I do have a video of it that I could send around after.
Sure. I'm sure we would all be very interested in that. And David, who you're usually over in England, have you been able to meet anybody on this before?
Me, honestly, I'm terrible with names and faces on those I meet, so I don't know who I've met and who I haven't. But I do know. I mean, firstly, it's interesting to hear, well, about the growth of Shira's company, and I'm looking forward to seeing the video. So yes, please do share that. But look, I mean, we're dealing with, and we all know what the situation's like. We know that at times it gets very lonely out there. And looking around, you got people like Eitan and Gil, or NGO Monitor. These companies, I mean, they're the leading brands when we're dealing with, pro-Israel advocacy and fighting back against the hate and demonization. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be sitting on this panel at the moment. And I follow everybody here.
Yeah, and Gil is one of those people that I just sort of assume everybody knows, even if they haven't met him. I'm just like, well, obviously they know Gil, or obviously they know Honest Reporting, because it's that kind of an organization that any pro-Israel person just needs to be following because of the work they're doing. Gil, how long have you been part of Honest Reporting, and how long has Honest Reporting been around? It predates you?
Oh my, Honest Reporting goes back to 2001, when there was a picture in the New York Times of a menacing-looking soldier above a bloody child that the New York Times said was a Palestinian child that was harmed by that soldier. When it turned out that the young man's father saw the picture in the New York Times in Chicago, he said, that's my kid. His name is Tuvia. He's Jewish. And that soldier, who's actually Druze, not Jewish, saved his life. And that led to an email group and then a website. I've only been there for 2 years. I covered politics for the Jerusalem Post for 24 before that. And then I was offered to lead the fight for Israel on the media battlefield. And I jumped at the chance. And since I joined Honest Reporting, we've gotten 12 anti-Semitic Hitler and Hamas praising journalists suspended, reassigned, or fired, with another 3 on the way when the superiors get back from their vacations and tell us if they fired the people that we've just exposed in the last 2 weeks from the Wall Street Journal, CBS, and AP. And more on the way, and more has to be done. And we've cooperated wonderfully with David, with Eitan, with NGO Monitor, and it's a pleasure to meet Shira, though her company frightens me.
Great to meet you too.
I'm sure you're not alone in being frightened by AI. That's something that a lot of people are intimidated by. I have. Let me give a quick shout out, because every time I do these sessions, I get the people saying, I get the what about people, and I don't just mean the what about the anti-Israel people. I mean the what about the people I didn't have on. You know, I would have loved to, and I did invite Hillel Neuer. Some of you helped to get it, so certainly he and UN Watch were very, very deserving of this same sort of topic. I also reached out to Tal Hagen. I got some flack from some people when they saw the poster and said, why isn't Tal on there? I'm like, I promise I invited him. And I also did invite Cheyenne over at the BBC, who's their person who's helped put the BBC in line a lot, and there's a lot more they need to do. And as well as a few other people. So I do want to just mention and appreciate that. There's actually somebody who specializes in Russian disinformation named Pekka, he's in the middle of promoting his book. Otherwise, he would have joined us. But this is fantastic, and it is a really small community, because it's not like there's dozens of people I could have invited to this. There were a handful of others. I mean, that's pretty impressive. So what you each do beyond impactful. So I'm going to start by asking sort of a general question. I'd like each of you to tell me, and it might be boring to you, but it won't be boring to us. When you're fact-checking a situation or a story, what is your process? I would love to know. And let's start with you, Gil, since we were last talking to you. What's the process for your organization?
So first of all, we do have AI as well. We're training an algorithm, optimizing the algorithm to be able to look at any article and be able to find the 8 categories of media bias that we normally look for in every article. And if it works, the algorithm, after a while of us looking for it, we're going to open it up to the public to be able to, on their own, be able to use this tool to be able to find media bias. So the categories include misleading terminology, imbalanced reporting, opinions disguised as news, lack of context, selective omission, using true facts to draw false conclusions, distortion of facts, and lack of transparency. Now, don't be surprised if you find all 8 of them in much of what you're reading, especially the farther we go away from October 7th. But when this tool is ready, you'll be able to use it and look at an article, and you'll find out these 3 or 4 are there.
How far away are we from your tool being ready?
It's taking its time, but we're ready, checking it every day. And it's good that AI, I'm sure Shira can speak about this as well, it's being used so effectively by our enemies, can be used also for good.
Okay. I love that, and I hope it will be well promoted and PR'd around the world when it is, because as you say, we need to utilize the same weapons our enemies are using for good. Absolutely. I want to know from the other person who represents, and I don't know if I would say, I don't know if it's fair to say similar, but another organizational fact checking, which is Olga. I'd like to know, based on what Gil just said, is it a comparable process, or do you guys have very different methodologies to honest reporting?
Well, I would say that it's not about the methodology that is different. I think value-wise, all the categories that Gil mentioned, we obviously look into them too, right? We first look into the transparency, whether an organization that is being quoted or the information that they quote seemingly, whether they're fully transparent. We check whether it is a fact or half fact, a distorted truth, because sometimes they will not blatantly lie, but they will tell a half story or a half truth, and they will omit a context, which makes all the difference. So in terms of the categories, it is pretty much the same thing, and I would assume that it is the same for all of us. It is more that, our scope, and I say this with every morning, and we get to work and we are sort of overwhelmed. The scope of the things that we look at is so humongous that sometimes it is disorienting. Why? Because we don't only look at the media. We don't fact check media stories the way that Gil does, but we have to look at the media because media quotes NGOs, non-governmental organizations, right, all the time. And that those same journalists that might not be accountable or transparent, and Gil will catch them in not being that, are quoting or relying or basing entirely their stories on NGOs. And perhaps a step back just to say what it is that we do. And it's actually funny that NGO Monitor was created the same year in 2001 after the Durban conference, right? Which is what we colloquially today refer to as the beginning of the BDS campaign as we know it today, or the delegitimization campaign, where these organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, these big names that everyone trusted blindly, they were gathering in South Africa to discuss racism and how to fight it. And instead of discussing global issue and challenges of racism, they decided that Zionism is racism. And this is where the whole thing was born. And our founder and president, Professor Steinberg, decided that this needs to be looked at. And 20-something years later, we're still fact-checking the NGOs. Why is it so challenging? Because they're quoted as reliable sources in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. They are quoted in, in the ICJs, in the South Africans claim at ICJ, there were 27 quotes to NGOs. And in the audience on the South African side, you had representatives of Al-Haq, the biggest Palestinian NGO, and Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. So the challenge is, mapping out all the different, if you'd like, battlefields or policy areas. Will you find them as liable and reliable, oftentimes regarded as entirely objective sources of truth, not more, not less, because as opposed to anyone on this call or even the journalists, where many will assume that they are not objective, right? Because you pointed in your introduction correctly that, we read New York Times with particular lenses, and we read Wall Street Journal with different lenses already, critical. But when it comes to Amnesty International, most of the people just trust them blindly. Or God forbid, when you say UNICEF, most of the people around the world just believe that UNICEF feeds, hungry children in Africa. What very few people know is that UNICEF relies on Palestinian NGOs that have been lobbying it to add IDF on its blacklist, together with Boko Haram and other terror organizations, for abusing children. So in that sense, our work is a little bit all over the place, because we follow the trace of the NGOs. And then the other aspect is we follow the money, because part of what we try to show is that you cannot call yourself independent if your entire budget comes from, 2-3 governmental and very politically clearly positioned sources. And more than that, many of them are actually funded through humanitarian governmental funds, and then there is the direct collision between what the European Union or the U.S. State Department and USAID claims to seek to build in the Middle East and what they fund through these NGOs.
Do any of you feel that it is ever not anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist? Because obviously, we could all say you can be critical of government. I can be critical of my U.S. government. Doesn't make me less patriotic. I can be critical of the current government at Israel or a past one. Doesn't make me love Israel less. That doesn't mean that I'm not a Zionist. It doesn't mean I'm not a patriot. I'm saying somebody who tries to say, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm just anti-Israel. I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. Is there any truth to that from any of your perspective in any examples, or is that just complete and utter bullshit?
Boaz, you told us we can swear here. I think that's total BS. And I think before October the 7th, we, all of us, sort of allowed that conversation to even take place. To me, at least personally, particularly after October the 7th, anyone who comes to me and says, I'm not an anti-Semite, I have tons of Jewish friends, or, my wife is Jewish actually, but I'm just anti-Zionist, I just call them out on what they are. They're anti-Semites for denying Jewish people their right for self-determination, because that's the only thing that Zionism actually stands for.
This is how we know that Olga is a mother. She said, you said we're allowed to curse then, and then she said the word BS. So I just want to put it out there. Do any of you feel any differently, or is it unanimous across the board?
I think there's the issue of theory and practice. I mean, if you come to me and you find me some guy sitting on a hilltop somewhere in India who's completely universalist, who doesn't believe in any borders or any kind of nationalism whatsoever, the guy is not going to support Israel. But that's a theoretical position. As soon as you're active, as soon as you pick up and you start to oppose something, and the one thing out of all of the nations that you've decided to oppose is Israel, it's absolutely anti-Semitism. So I'd say in practice, every single time.
I think that's a interesting way to put it, because, and I want to hear what Eitan has to say, but you're reminding me of essentially what UN Watch is about, because they're saying, hey, you want to criticize Israel, they better not be the only country you criticize every single bloody time. And that's what we're looking at, and why it goes from being fair critique to just bullshit. That's how you curse Olga. You say bullshit. All right. Eitan, what were you going to say?
I'm European. We're nice.
I mean, I agree with both David and Olga for the most part. I would say that through my various interactions with, college-age people in America, I would say that they are, I'm not going to curse, but how do I put this lightly? Some of them are less than super smart, like the people on this panel, let's say. And so I think that there's just an unbelievable level of ignorance. And so you have people that go to, let's say, Ivy League schools. And I've spoken to them. I've spoken to people from Harvard that are currently students and from Yale and all the cool Ivy League schools. And they literally have no idea what they're talking about. I don't know how to say it more bluntly or less bluntly. It's just they have no clue what they're talking about. And so when I said, what's Zionism? And they said, Zionism, it's an ethno-nationalist bull. And I go, okay, well, what's the actual definition of Zionism? And they go, it's an ethno-nationalist. And I go, okay, so you have no idea what you're talking about. And you just so in other words, I guess maybe I'm a little bit too forgiving. I don't know, but I think that so much of it is attributable to just stupidity, right? So that, in other words, I make a differentiation between the people that are, let's say, leading the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters on the university campuses, or the people that work for, I don't know, guys, all the organizations that Olga knows and loves, right? That she goes after all the time. The heads of those organizations, those chapters, they know exactly what they're doing. They know that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. They know what Zionism actually means. It just means the Jewish right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland, right? But then there's the people that are, the hundreds or the thousands of people across the campuses that have literally no clue what they're talking about. And so I'm trying really hard to give them the benefit of the doubt, and say that they're not inherently, anti-Semitic. Sometimes I think that they're not anti-Semitic, and then I'm proven wrong. But I'm trying to remain optimistic. Honestly, maybe Shira could probably speak more to that, because I assume you were in MIT more recently than I mean, I was never in MIT, but probably in school more recently than I was. So.
Yeah, so I went to undergrad at U Chicago, but then a little bit of a step down from MIT. But yeah, it was quite different when I was in Cambridge and when I was at U Chicago. So I wasn't as involved in Jewish life at U Chicago, but then once I moved to Cambridge, I definitely felt more of a presence. Like there's actually a huge overlap between like the physics community and the Jewish community. There's this org called Shabtai, which hosts like physics and Judaism dinners, like, and conferences, not conferences, but just like talks around a lot of campuses. I went to a couple of their events in Cambridge. I think they started at Yale, but don't quote me. But they're still operating. They start in the fall again because they tend to operate when school is going on. But I definitely felt that I had a greater sense of Jewish community in Cambridge than I did in at U Chicago. But that was also partly just due to my own like selecting while I was a little bit younger. Because I went to Jewish high school, so I wanted to kind of like explore outside the Jewish bubble, however you put it, when I was in undergrad. But then I kind of came back to it once I graduated. And I would say that there was like SJP while I was at U Chicago definitely had their whole little presentations where they would put stuff on the quad, and where it would be like posters or just like cardboard cutouts, and with whatever slogans. I tended to just try to ignore it.
What becomes more of the unicorn are the young people who are able to withstand this, because what you end up having is people, you know, Eitan was talking about ignorance, whether most people are ignorant or not, and so on. Well, first of all, I coined a term early on after October 7th when I talked about the problems with social media algorithms and confirmation bias. And I said that what we're seeing here is a heightened state of radicalized ignorance. That's what we're dealing with. It's a term you're all welcome to use, because that's the only term that makes sense to me, because you have not only people being ignorant about it, but they're not just genteel in their ignorance like they used to be. I grew up being your typical ignorant person about whatever random world issue. You know, when I was a teenager, when I was in college, I didn't know if Richard Gere held up a sign that said Free Tibet at the Oscars, I didn't actually have an opinion about Free Tibet because I didn't really know what the geopolitical nuance was. So most people were more like me, and most of us in our different age groups usually grew up where we knew when to stay in our lane. We didn't scream about things we didn't know about. We asked questions, or we didn't ask questions, but we certainly didn't make things our causes if we knew that we didn't know what we didn't know. And what seems to have happened now is the ignorance has taken a left and right turn where it just doesn't know how to stay in its own lane and just be saying, hey, I'd like to ask more questions about it. It's people who actually have become, again, radicalized in their ignorance, and they're all and they all are screaming about things that they know very little about. When I did my second episode, it was with 35 college students. And I did this, partnering up with Stand With Us and Camera on Campus and Israel Campus Coalition and so on. And these 35 students were from across the country, and they were completely different, male, female, black, white, religious, non-religious, but certainly they were all Jewish and they all were Zionist. And I'm sorry, I am very good at always wanting people from the left and the right on all of my sessions. I always want people on the left and the right. My common denominator, though, is that people at least believe in the concept of Zionism. If somebody believes Israel shouldn't exist, I'm sorry, I don't need to give you more oxygen. You have enough oxygen in social media. You don't need mine as well. But if you can at least be on the left but Zionist and on the right and Zionist, I would love to give you as much airtime as possible. So here I had all these students, and I asked them a very specific question relevant to what Eitan and Shira are talking about. I said to them, I would like you to answer a question, show of hands, who here thinks that the majority of people on their campuses, because they all had campus protests and sit-ins, the majority of the people on them, are they true Hamas supporters? Are they truly anti-Semitic in their core? Or are they people who genuinely don't have any idea anything, and they generally don't even realize they're being nasty in terms of Jews? And they said, far and away, the majority of the people there are ignorant. Yes, they're ignorant people who just have no idea. Doesn't make what they're doing any less hurtful. but most of them are just totally ignoramus. Now, the people organizing the events and a lot of the people they bring in and the people they recruit and people who are part of the SJP community, totally different story. But they manage to get a lot of allies from other groups, from other intersectional groups and so on, who say, hey, that looks like a good cause. And suddenly they make it their cause, but they can't actually tell you anything. So it's very, very sad. But hopefully people who are watching this are amongst the type of audience who are not radicalized in ignorance. They're people who want to learn. Olga, I think you're about to try to say something.
Yeah, I just think that it's not only sad, I think it's very dangerous. And I agree with Eitan. I think that most of the people in the world are mainly ignorant. They're being fed. Most of the people don't necessarily even have an opinion on the Middle East conflict. They sit down in the evening to watch their news, and there's a tiny section of international news, and it's not their fault that the biggest part of it, biggest chunk, is reserved always for Israel in a very specific, way of conveying the media, the news. But the dangerous thing is that they are being mobilized now, and they are being used and abused, as an ignorant mass. And I always say this. It always starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And there was always anti-Semitism. There always will be anti-Semitism. It is the oldest hatred in the world, and we will never uproot it properly. And, if I can quote my husband, actually, he will say that a decent dosage of anti-Semitism is not necessarily a bad thing for us Jews, because it keeps us, it makes us maintain our identity, and it sort of safeguards us from assimilating too quickly. But the difference is that there are historical peaks when the societal malfunctioning gets to a certain level, and that the barometer of where we are, on that malfunctioning, is how much Jew hatred there is at that very moment. And we just spoke that, HonestReporting and NGO Monitor were created after the Durban conference, basically. And we all thought that that's like the worst thing that we will ever see in our, for me as a Jewish student activist back then, we were mind blown, because Europe was celebrating the diversity and, multiculturalism and all these lovely ideas. But actually, we're seeing a much bigger peak in Jew hatred now. And I think that it just shows that there's an overheating of the hatred and lack of tolerance across the board in our societies. And we are just the barometer.
David, I'd like you to, in addition to whatever you're about to say, David, I actually want you to tell us about your process, because it's a very different animal what you do as an individual, because you don't have organizational backing.
No, I don't. Actually, the way I work actually plays into what I was actually going to say anyway. I mean, my process is very different, because to me, I rely a lot on, obviously, what HonestReporting and NGO Monitor do, because these two, they have incredible databases of 20 years plus now of history. But for me, it's about the people, always about the people. So when I see a media report, probably more in the fashion of what Eitan does than the others, when I see a report, I'm looking for names. The name of the journalist, fair enough, but the name of the people the journalist spoke to, the name of the witnesses, the name of the doctor, the name of the medic, the name of every single name in a report, because they're not just names, they're actual people. And you can flesh them out. You go and you find them on social media, because that's the one thing that the journalists don't normally do. So that's my process. My process is taking a name and then go hunting for this person and fleshing him out to turn him into basically a real person, with family, with a mother and a father, and brother and children, and where he lives and what he does and what he thinks and what he says and what he posts. And from there, of course, we can find out things that the journalist should have known. There's more than enough examples over the last 7 or 8 months of mainstream news just relying on people that are effectively just terrorist families. So that's my process. It's all about the fleshing out of the people. couple of things. One thing that was just said about how dangerous the current situation is. I think we're underestimating the danger. And I also think we're being too lenient when we're talking about ignorance. The one thing that and absolutely right, going through, and I love history, going through and looking at the historical highs and lows. But the one thing we have never had before is the issue that is driving this one today, and that's social media. And I think we're a generation away from truly understanding the damage that social media is doing to society. You actually referenced it in your opening, where you're saying you're standing there in the middle and you're looking at the people on both sides just being dragged further and further out to the extremes. And it's a process of self-radicalization. It's self-radicalization. And it's not so much dependent on the media as it is on social media. And what I do, and the way I work, I spend most of my time in the sewers of anti-Zionism. That's where I spend my day. I go onto Facebook accounts that look nothing like the Facebook accounts that you have. You know, it's full of this hate, which is where I want to bring up the issue of the ignorance. Because yes, they are ignorant. But if it was just a naive ignorance, these guys wouldn't be in social media bubbles that were completely radicalized. They would still be seeing here and there the two-sided arguments, because they would still have some people within their bubble posting positive stuff, arguing the other way. The fact that they're not, the fact that what they've been doing is self-radicalization, they've been blocking people that they disagree with. They've been cutting ties with those that, you know, stand in opposition to their basic core values, and creating for themselves a more and more insular environment all the time. And honestly, I go up and I open it in the morning, and all you see, it's fake news beyond belief. And it is fed into them every single day, all day. They truly believe that Israel is out there killing Palestinian babies deliberately, non-stop. And this is creating the environment that I was just referencing. Really, really dangerous. More dangerous, I think, than we yet really fathom.
I can only imagine what your social media algorithms must look like, because you're literally choosing to go into these horrendous accounts. I'd probably have nightmares just opening your feed.
Yeah. Well, no, and actually it actually plays into the anti-Semitic conspiracies, because what happens is, I mean, like, firstly, there's no, I mean, as much as we spend our time, you know, looking at the CBCs and CNNs and NYTs of the world, none of that exists in that world. None of it. It's all alternative media sources. It's all bloggers and you know, I mean, it's TikToks and IG. There's no mainstream media at all. But what they do have is they have a constant feed of all of these horror stories, repeated over and over and over again. And it can be real, it can be fake, it can be repetitive, it can be 10 years old, it can be whatever. And this is where they spend their day. And then they turn their computer off and they turn on their TV and they don't see it. And that question comes to them. Well, look, I know that Israel has killed 400 Palestinian babies today, because all of these truth tellers on social media are telling me, why is CNN not talking about it? Why is NY, why is the New York Times? And it creates the Zionist controls the media. It's reinforcing that conspiracy for them. It's really frightening stuff, really.
Oh yeah, some of the old school anti-Semitism has come out to roost very easily. I haven't had any dangerous incidents, thank God, in Los Angeles since October 7th yet, but I have had not one, but two different incidents where I've been just sitting there. I'm a poker player on the side for fun, and I've gone to the casino, my kippah off, and I'm sitting there playing poker, and I've had two different instances when people at the table just started to casually start to talk about just the most old school Jews controlling the media type thing, and nobody at the table saying a damn word about it. So it's definitely coming out more as we see things like this, you know, the normalization of the Kanye Wests, so to speak. And I know I'm dead naming him, but you know, sorry, not sorry to Kanye. It's amazing. Anybody watching this who hasn't seen David Collier's stuff, you'd be astounded if you look at any of his posts when they come out. You would think 30 people had worked on it for a year. It's like a thesis. Just every single person he's just found out.
Apologies.
It's pretty amazing what you do, I have to say. Now speaking of something huge and amazing, before we get to talking about AI, which I want to get into as well, because that's always an elephant in the room with technology, I want to talk about Eitan's process specifically, at least starting with, tell us your UNRWA story, because we all know what happened with UNRWA. Most of the world seems to still be an ostrich with their head in the sand, but you played a huge pivotal role in uncovering what happened, even if you downplay it. It all started with a Telegram chat. So tell us what your process was and how it happened and so on.
Sure. So obviously, everyone here and organizations like NGO Monitor and UN Watch have been on this UNRWA hobby horse for a very long time, and many other organizations. I'll tell you sort of the story of what happened, what I did, and then how I thought to do it like that. But basically, what happened was, and I'm going to be super casual about it. I was in bed one night, I couldn't sleep. And so when I can't sleep, you go on social media, you doom scroll, you do this for a million years, and you see if either inspiration hits, or let's say, I think David will probably empathize with this. You see something that kind of like tingles your muscle, like, wait a minute, this seems weird. This could be a thing that I'm going to look into. And for whatever reason, there was an UNRWA post on my screen, and I thought to myself, well, I wonder if UNRWA has a Telegram channel. It was really just, it was that simple. And it's like, I wonder if they have a Telegram channel. I went on Telegram, which for those who don't know is sort of like, I guess you'd call it like, I don't know, WhatsApp, but Russian owned, Russian government affiliated and encrypted and anonymous, and nobody knows who's on it and whatever. And I went on and I did UNRWA, and then a group came up of UNRWA teachers. Obviously, I scrolled back to October 7th to see what they were talking about, these UNRWA teachers on October 7th. And there it was, and I'll spare you the gory details.
Wait, you didn't even need to beg permission to join the group? It wasn't a secure group?
So that's the thing. So it wasn't, so Telegram has secure channels that you have to sort of get let into, which those are difficult to. You have like a fake avatar and have like a story or whatever. And then there are open channels. And the beauty about social media, and we can all understand this, is that people only started to realize that social media is kind of a thing in this respect in, what is it, guys, like probably 2020. But if you go to people, at least that's in the West. I don't know what it's like in the Arab world or in Gaza or whatever, but they just don't realize that, okay, maybe I shouldn't post overt terror support or anti-Semitism on social media, because like someone's gonna go look for it, right? And so I went on the UNRWA Telegram channel, October 7th, I scrolled down, and they were all like, oh wow, this is amazing. They're slaughtering people, innocent people, soldiers, men, women, children. It's great. And I said to myself, okay, this probably seems like something. And in hindsight, I probably should have done things a little bit differently. But what I ended up doing was just kind of spontaneously making a thread on Twitter/X. And I tagged a lot of organizations in the post. And I said, guys, if anyone wants to take a look at this, because it's I think midnight my time, and I'm really tired. And then next thing I know, UN Watch had a big thing about it, and they were gracious enough to give me a shout out. And then things kind of spiraled from there. As far as though how I understood what was going on, is that there are various AI tools. We're always talking about AI. AI is dangerous, but it could also be very, very useful and helpful for us. And I think that it's important that we understand that we have an amazing opportunity now, that we don't necessarily always need to have an organization with 50 employees or 100 employees to do good work. It's enough that you have motivation, internet access, and let's call it patience. And you use the AI tools, to help translate text in Arabic in a more sophisticated way than just Google Translate. If you're looking at voice recordings on the UNRWA Telegram channel, or videos that don't have subtitles, there are AI tools out there that can easily transcribe it, and they're actually pretty accurate. You should probably get it vetted if you're going to take it to a newspaper, and confirm that it says what it says it says. But generally speaking, they're pretty accurate. And so yeah, I saw the post, I translated them, I transcribed whatever I needed to transcribe, and within an hour and a half, I had it ready, and pretty much any researcher could have done what.
Pretty much anybody could have, but nobody else did. So you know what? You're the one who discovered the new planet. Somebody else did. So what you mentioned very casually, you would have done it differently had you done it over. What would you have done differently?
I think that if you're, let's say, trying to to execute a campaign of sorts, like a public awareness campaign. You know, guys, UNRWA is linked to terror. The UNRWA teachers are supporting terrorism. These are the people teaching the people in Gaza, the kids in Gaza. I probably would have made it the thread cleaner. I probably would have spoken to some organizations, reached out before just making a Twitter thread. Because, you know, it got some views, but I think that when you're doing a public awareness campaign, it should be well thought out, and the opening salvo should hit as hard as possible to generate the most headlines. I'm very happy with how much traction it ended up creating. UN Watch wrote an amazing report, you know, based on the Telegram channel that they actually, Hill presented it in Congress in a congressional hearing, which was really cool. But again, I think that had I had the foresight and had not been sleep deprived at the time, I probably would have put more thought into what I did.
You know, you mentioned
In subsequent things that I've done, like when I've uncovered, let's say, journalists who, you know, actually one of the three hostages were actually being held by a journalist in Gaza, and I sort of stumbled upon that as well, and I realized that the hostages were being held by a journalist, which is crazy. And so when I sort of unveiled that, I put a little bit more thought into that and spoke to people beforehand and had some things prepared beforehand. And so that was a little bit smoother and I think made a little bit more impact.
Thank you for taking credit for something you actually did, which you deserve to take credit for. Gil, I feel like you're about to chime in and say something.
Journalist.
Oh,
I was holding back.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Hamas member who was moonlighting as a journalist when he was not working concurrently as a spokesperson for the Hamas Ministry of Labor, and the outlet that he was working for, the Palestine Chronicle, is actually a 501c3 based in Washington State, which is being subsidized by everyone's taxpayer dollars. So to the audience, congratulations, your tax money is going to an organization that employs a Hamas terrorist hostage taker. Thank you, Gil, for the fact check. Sorry about that.
No problem. The Committee to Protect, thank you for everyone before. And the Committee to Protect Journalists didn't update their website for 2 months with their list of dead journalists. When this journalist happened to be killed doing his day job of hostage holder, we dared them. Are you going to include him too? Because our studies had found that 2/3 of the people on the list were terrorists or work for media outlets that are run by the terrorist organizations. And it was mysterious that they went from every day updating their list to not updating their list for 2 months until a journalist actually got killed. And then now we have a real journalist got killed in a real incident as a real journalist, and then they could go back to it.
I DM'd the head of the Committee to Protect Journalists and a bunch of people, and I because her Twitter was open to DMs.
Did they ever get back to you?
No, of course they never got back to me, but I said, hey,
They didn't get back to us either.
Is your name Jody? I forgot her name.
She has a Jewish name, Ginsburg or something.
Something like that, yeah. And I said, hey, so FYI, you know, just you're gonna make a statement on this or something, and nothing.
It's ridiculous. You know, you brought up the idea of, you know, people not catching up. It's new since 2020, and that's how people were being stupid, and to our benefit to catch them on things like Telegram. How about a different example, bigger or more surprising, let's just say, than Telegram? What about Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia itself, it was a few months ago, my friend in Israel, Itai Chamiel, shout out to one of my oldest friends in the world, he messages me some links straight up to the Wikipedia Arabic page. And right on the top of the Wikipedia Arabic page, he showed me the translations where on every single one of the pages, I forget what it was, but it was something along the lines of like, glory to our martyrs. And it was something about, it was very, very, very anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, horrible, horrible stuff. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and there was not a single article about it anywhere. I couldn't find a single social media post about it anywhere. So, I mean, I took it to a couple of places, and it finally started to get seen, first by a little bit more of a right-wing, smaller outlet took it, and then it got picked up more beyond that. And now the Jewish Journal, I think it was my buddy Brian Fischbach might have been the one who just did a nice cover story on it. But the point is, like, Wikipedia, it's supposed to be the equivalent of the digital dictionary, right? Encyclopedia. It's crazy.
I mean, it's like if you're writing a serious piece, you cannot source your things off Wikipedia. I mean, the
If I'm
sad
not
truth
mistaken,
is,
ChatGPT sources Wikipedia.
which is part
ChatGPT
of the
and which is
problem. Yeah.
crazy. Yeah.
Well, it's not just the sourcing. I mean, if you actually Google anything, then Google will return the Wikipedia article as its top result. I did some research into Wikipedia, 8, 9 years ago now, and just basic stuff, looking at the editors, and however bad you think it is, it's worse. It really is. I wouldn't go near it, and I think there would be a campaign to make sure not just that. Because if you go to university these days, you're told you can't reference you like Wikipedia, but you can use it as a primary source to take out and go and looking elsewhere. So it will give you the list of sources at the bottom, and then you can go with that. I actually think there's room for a campaign to actually have it completely blocked at schools. I think it really is bad stuff. I mean, you go the one of the pages I looked at was the engineer, the person who made the suicide bombs, and the editors had gone in and turned him into some kind of saint. They'd removed, and you can actually follow it, because the only good thing about Wikipedia is how transparent it is. So you can actually follow the editorial process, and you can see who changed what. So it started off as a fairly reasonable page, and then slowly somebody goes in and makes a tiny change, and then they remove the number of people who died in the suicide bombings, and then they change something else, and then they talk about how nice the engineer was, and then they talk about how he actually wanted to go off and be a doctor in Jordan, but he wasn't allowed to, so blaming the Israelis for the fact that, over time, it just evolved into this completely beautiful page about this wonderful man. And it really is astonishing how long it went on without nobody really noticing.
David, I'm not so well versed in Wikipedia, but can you analyze if it's the same couple of dozen, I don't know what you call them, editors that are doing?
Yes, you can, and not just
Someone needs
you
to
could
do
actually
some sort of like data analysis, like a link
there,
analysis, and see if it's all the same users editing the picture, the
it
pages at
often
once.
is. What I think would be a worthwhile project, because you're not allowed to collaborate on Wikipedia. I reckon that, again, AI is not my field at all, but I believe that if you were to go in, you would be able to show correlation between the times that these different editors were posting on the pages, and the way they were posting, and when they were posting together, and on what page, because I believe there's obviously a highly effective network behind the scenes that's doing it, together.
Right.
Well, I want to switch over to AI now for a minute, and I want to hear about Shira's process. And I'd also definitely like to know, given what we're talking about here, if AI is influenced or caused by user inputs, which I think at least largely it is, how can bias be prevented?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. And even before LLMs really took off, there was a question of AI bias in data sets. Because if you think about AI in health, if data sets were primarily of one ethnicity or one general like gene pool, then you're not getting as much diversity in the data set to see how the medications will affect or how different treatments will affect people with different expressions. So there's already been like the issue of bias in terms of the text that's coming out. And of course, that's influenced by the text that you're putting in, because essentially what you're doing is it's doing the log probabilities of the most likely next token. So it's predicting what's coming after the text that's already written. But essentially, if you put in something that's like inherently anti-Israel or inherently pro-Hamas, current LLMs, some LLMs at least, have some guardrails or try to have some guardrails where they wouldn't necessarily entertain certain things that they deem that the people designing them, or not designing the LLMs, but designing the guardrails, deem to be off limits. But that's not necessarily going to cover everything that is in the colloquial mind off limits. And then you have open source AI, like like Llama 3.1b and 3.1405b, which is the largest model that has been released. It's 405 billion parameters. And essentially things like that, you're getting a more uncensored AI because it's open source, so they don't have as strict guardrails or any guardrails at all, really. So it's a little bit different, but most of these LLMs are trained on Common Crawl, which is a crawl of the web. And essentially what's on the web is gonna come out in the conversations in some respect, if you tap into it. So when you augment LLMs with external data, then that's where you're gonna get more answers that are tailored to that data.
Are you saying that open source AI is inherently more susceptible to misinformation because it's open source AI?
Not necessarily. It's just they don't have as strict guardrails or guardrails in general. And that can be a good thing in certain cases because, for instance, when I was trying to process a lot of the anti-Israel or pro-Hamas data from TikTok, sometimes using OpenAI's model, it would give me errors that, I'm sorry, we cannot complete this request, or I'm sorry, the topic matter is beyond this request, like beyond what we're allowed to entertain. And essentially once I transitioned to using open source models, then that wasn't a problem anymore. But so there are some benefits to open source, and open source in general, there are a lot of benefits to open source AI, but in terms of what's more susceptible to kind of unhinged conspiracy theory or untrue information, then open source AI is a little bit gonna be more susceptible to that because you could kind of fine tune it on anything. There's no guardrails going through, and there's no system going through and checking the prompts that you put in and saying, is this prompt violating our terms of service or not? Because when you're using these major APIs, like when you're using OpenAI's API, they have other LLM systems, large language model systems, that will go through all of the prompts that are submitted to their API and tell you and basically say whether any of them are violating terms of service. So like they have a term of service where you're not allowed to use their API on behalf of any political candidate. And my company had been a few months prior servicing a super PAC. And so OpenAI actually reached out to me and said, this is against their terms of service. And we detected it. I didn't know that they were going through their, I didn't know this was against their terms of service, but they basically have a system that goes through every prompt that's submitted to their API and says, is this against terms of service? Is this not against terms of service? And if it is against terms of service, they send you this email saying you have to stop using the API in this way or for this purpose.
Gil was talking about honest reporting creating, at some point in time, mañana, in the future, they're going to have their AI that's going to help debunk things, and it'll be a great tool. Is there a way right now with what we have out there to use AI to reliably debunk lies, an app that might scan news and articles for us?
So there's something called retrieval augmented generation, and this was actually an idea that I had been wanting to try, but it's a bottleneck to it, and this is what it's going to be, an obvious bottleneck when this comes up. Basically what retrieval augmented generation is it's hooking an LLM up to an external corpus of data. So essentially you could do it with like an FAQ for a website, or you could do it with a book, and then you can talk to that data through the LLM. So it's referencing this external data and bringing it into context before it responds to you. The most relevant parts of this external data, it's bringing into context before it responds to you.
So basically what you're saying is that, if you load the proper or a corpus of information into the AI, right? If you load Honest Reporting's information, NGO Monitor's information, cameras and for David's, UN Watch, you name it. And then you sort of have the AI when it's, set upon a news article, the news article or the AI will then take the text from the news article and sort of compare it with what's written in the corpus and then see if it matches up. That's what you're saying. And if it doesn't match up, there's an issue. So if UN Watch says, oh, okay, UNRWA is linked to terrorists, to Hamas, and then the article in, let's say, CNN says there's no link between UNRWA and Hamas, then the AI will say, oh, no, that's an error. That's a mistake. That's inaccurate. That's what I think.
No, absolutely. That's
Okay.
exactly what I'm. No, absolutely, yeah. And you could do it in other ways too, where you can like have conversations with the data, but that's exactly what I was getting at with how you could use it for this. The only problem with that is as new stories are breaking, updating that data bank, it's going to be difficult to do in real time because say a story that's misinformation comes out first or a story that's real information comes out, but you don't have that in the data bank yet because it's not like recent enough. So that's where it becomes a bottleneck. And that's why I didn't end up doing something like that. But there are ways around it if you update it like in real time, but it's just like who gets to what first. And it's almost like a chase to it's almost like a chase, it's a catch-22 where it's like if something is real, but you don't have the data bank ready, then you won't know that it's real.
I've been listening to her and it made me want to emphasize something that I wanted to raise earlier anyways. She's pointing to another very important issue, and that is the need to regulate. And I think all of us here are in that business. We're all basically saying, here's evidence of the problems, the challenges, the lies, the distortions, the inaccuracies, all these things. And then here's what we think you should do. And you can be the campus, administration. It can be our elected officials and parliaments and governments. It can be social media providers, any of those. And the challenge remains that we still rely on the process, the due diligence, the legal advisors in our teams, by the time we vet the information and test it. And then by the time I've ran everything by my legal advisor before, I don't want to accuse someone, of something without making sure that I'm not going to get sued and so on and so on. The other side released a total lie. And it did what it was supposed to do. And that was only one thing. And I think this is what we are up against. And the one thing that it was supposed to do is create an emotional reaction. And then we spend months, if not years, in trying to persuade the people who already had an emotional reaction that the reaction was fake. But it doesn't even matter anymore. So we're like fighting. We're not playing the same game, it's like we are, and I'm not saying this as an accusation because I take pride in the fact that all of us are serious people who would not release nonsense, out there in the world. But it's just, it just shows that even, Shira's talking like gibberish to me, like I haven't understood anything. But by the time that Eitan translated him, I was like, oh, thank you, which just probably means that I'm that old. But it did make it clear that we still, even Shira, who is young and deals with this super duper technological, innovative topic, is down to we need regulation. And we were now, in the last couple of months trying to push Meta, right, Facebook, to regulate more. What do they take off? What do they not? What is sanctioned? What is not? It's still the same game. And to me, post October the 7th, I keep asking this question to myself and to my team. How do we change the game? How do we up the game? And I mean, I don't know the answer, but it just kept striking me as Shira was talking.
Well, let me ask you guys a question that everybody's gonna be able to relate to. If you have 15 minutes a day that you're going to gather your news, how would you recommend a normal person, not like any of you who all actually are used to this process, but when you're talking to somebody, whether they are a 12-year-old or whether they are a grandma using a computer, how do people actually get their news with some modicum of reliability and accuracy these days? What would you recommend?
There's nowhere. There's no, if you're sitting there in America, use your local paper, the website of your local paper to get your sports and weather and nothing else. If you want to get your news about Israel, you can get, if you know Hebrew, you can get it from Hebrew media outlets in Israel. If you know only English, then you're stuck with my friends at the Jerusalem Post and Times of Israel and I-24, and my wife is the editor-in-chief of ILTV. Check it out. But I'll take you back. When I was at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, the best journalism school in the world, they brought in the foreign editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and they had him speak only with the students interested in working abroad. And after he spoke, I got to ask the first question. I remember, I'm 22 years old. I said, your business model makes no sense. You send a reporter to China, and by the time they understand any Chinese, you send them to Moscow. And then after 3 years, you send them to Jerusalem, and you expect them to know the depth of a 3,000-year-old conflict. And by the time they understand a little Hebrew and Arabic, you're sending them off to Washington. Why would I get my news from you when I can get my news from a media outlet based in Israel, where the people have been there for 20 years, have really good sources that they've built up over 20 years, and can tell me the truth? And he didn't like that question very much, but I think it's only become more true over time. Back then, people still read print newspapers. Not that old, but this was 25 years ago. Now, why would anyone get their news about Israel from a paper based in New York, when you can get your news about Israel from a media outlet based here? It just doesn't make any logical sense.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. So how would you adapt such a thing to somebody wanting to get good news about Iran? Does that mean they're reading an Iranian paper, or Russia? Or Ukraine? Are they reading Russian papers? How does somebody adapt your model that you're suggesting, which I can obviously identify with for Israel, but for anywhere in the world that you want to get your news reliably?
Iran International is a dissident outlet that reports about what's going on in the street over there. That's possible. It happens to be that the Jerusalem Post takes very seriously the Iran issue. Jeremy Bob is a wonderful reporter with great connections. And he can tell you what's going on because Iran affects Israel so much. But if you're dealing with the way Iran, it deals with things that are not related to Israel, then that's different, obviously.
It's very interesting, and it's very sad, of course, because at the end of the day, it basically means that we're sort of in a well, I guess we'll figure it out in the afterlife type situation in terms of actually getting anywhere reliably. My own personal strategy has been constantly, since I started writing about COVID, was to make sure that I was just looking at all of the different sources on the left and the right, and that's the best I could do. And I sort of looked for what was common between this and common between this, and that seems to be the truth. It's like, all right, well, this is what, David Agus is telling me, and this is what, Trump was saying here, and this is what Biden's people were saying here, and the Department of Public Health, and you'd see all these differences, and I would get rid of whatever else, cut out the fad, and I would use my Venn diagram, like, they seem to agree about this. That seems to be something I can reliably work with. But while that may have been helpful and good, most people don't have that sort of time in their life, nor, and not to toot my own horn, but nor the brain capacity in their life to figure it out. Not everybody has Shira's AI tech genius, and not everybody has, the rest of your guys' ability and capacity to take, a beautiful mind type levels of like information all over the place. So it's depressing. But do you guys have any, besides what Gil just said, which is very helpful, look at JPost and look at ILTV and so on, but especially for people who are not fluent in Hebrew, who cannot read Hebrew, for people like Patrick, who's recording the call for us, who is Christian and supportive and only speaks English, what would you suggest as helpful tips moving forward so people can feel more reliable with what they understand?
Use AI to translate. just copy paste into Claude or into, I don't know if you guys know Claude, but that's Anthropic's alternative to ChatGPT. It's not arguably, it is a better model. Claude Sonnet. And basically what you could do is you could just copy paste the entirety of the article in a foreign language into the chat and say, translate this for me. And it'll translate it into English. You don't know necessarily the reliability of the translation, but like for the most part, it tends to be pretty reliable.
You're telling me that that's far more useful than Google Translate, which everybody uses.
Oh, absolutely.
You also, if you don't have that, if you just have basic ChatGPT, I found that you actually have to tell ChatGPT not to just Google Translate. Again, you know, I've actually had this a few times where I went to ChatGPT and I said, translate this, please. And it gave me one thing. And then I said to it, translate this again. Don't just Google Translate, but give me an actual translation. And it would give me something that looked a little bit different. And then I know people who speak a lot of different languages. The one that I usually need is Arabic for my research. And so I asked them, hey, you know, how does this, you know, ChatGPT translation, once I put this specific prompt into it, how does that, you know, stack up with what it actually says? And, you know, my buddies who speak Arabic, they say, yeah, you know, it's like 96% of the way there. There are a couple of nuances that it doesn't quite hit sometimes, but, you know, it's not going to say that up is down and red is blue, right? Like there's some level of sophistication there. They're pretty reliable for the most part. Again, you know,
this is awesome. No, this is awesome. I love this. Is exactly what I wanted. You're giving me and anybody watching this actual actionable tips for this, which is great. I mean, even people who won't be able to see the chat going on, but right now during this chat, people within this wanted to know, you know, what are these websites? What are the names of these things? Because even we within this would like to know. So this is great. David, Olga, do either of you guys have actionable tips that you'd like to give?
Firstly, I'm a bit of a pessimist, and normally when I give talks at places, I start with an apology because I tend to depress people. I mean, everybody, I would imagine, on this panel is a bit of a cynic, given the work that we do. You know, we're talking about translating. I mean, I deal with the Hebrew press as well on a daily basis. You know, whether it's you know, Channel 12 or 13, and some of the issues that we deal with on a daily basis with the English press still replicate themselves within the Hebrew press. My advice to anyone, the only thing I can really say to them is just remember that no matter where you're sourcing the material, you're sourcing it from a human being. And in today's world, in the media, most journalists have pretty much become activists themselves. And just remember that you're dealing with someone who has opinions, has political opinions, and they're putting those political opinions into the articles. I can't help you tell you which one is true and which one is not. All I can do is arm you with that cynicism to approach the media with real doubt. Question absolutely everything you're told.
That makes
Well,
sense.
if I can, I'd like to raise that or to an even, you know, another level or zoom out even more compared to David. I think that what we've discussed now is trying to remedy a symptom of a problem, which is why we today, and I put emphasis on younger generations, because as you, Boaz, pointed correctly, we studied even our degrees differently. We research differently. We use libraries, actual books, you know, and we had to look for things physically, and that is not the case today, nor is the pace the same, right? For us, it used to take weeks or months to write a thesis or something, and today with social media, with internet, with Google, with AI, you can do that in a completely different pace. I think the bigger problem is how do we regulate stupidity? Someone mentioned here, the problem is not that people are ignorant. The problem is that people are ignorant, but then they want to take it to the streets and become activists based off their ignorance. So people will chant from the river to the sea, but they have no idea which river and which sea. They don't even know on which, you know, on which continent, you know, the conflict is physically taking place. I mean, that's the level. So how do you regulate stupidity? And that's one of the challenges of NGO Monitor, because on one hand, we are in the same space with everyone here, but at the same time, most of the times, we're not trying to educate or re-educate the broader public. That's not our main target audience. Our main target audience are actually the elected officials, the government, the policy makers, and journalists to a certain degree, because they rely on these NGOs and what they say. And it is my belief, or at least that is my passion. I don't think I can change the hearts and minds of the masses. In Hebrew, we say katonti, it's too big for me. I wouldn't even know where to start. But I do believe that we absolutely have to insist on calling out policymakers everywhere in the world. And, David said that in Israel, we have our share of decent challenges, with our policymakers. So it's a universal problem of absolutely demanding that they're more transparent and they're more accountable, and there's more regulation of what is allowed to be released in the public space, because words do matter. Once you allow something to be said and repeated 100, 200, 1,000, 1,000,000 times, it becomes a fact. What is ChatGPT? What is AI? What is Google? It learns, right? The more often you say something, the more of a fact, right, it becomes. It's an algorithm. Our minds, at the end of the day, operate in the same way. And if we don't call out the policymakers, the papers, right, the institutes, or whatever it is, those one, it's still the same intelligentsia, if you'd like, that dictates the public discourse, that the masses are being fed off, we will continue to see the same issues. But having said that, I do think that we cannot abandon any one of the battlefields, which is why all of us on this call absolutely have to continue, doing what they're doing, because while some of us are focusing on the policy level, there is a need for an entire army of people like Eitan and everyone else who wake up in the middle of the night, and they just have this bug, I see something weird. And you would be surprised that a lot of our discoveries are born exactly the same way. I'll get a phone call in the middle of the night or a WhatsApp from one of my researchers, and he'll go like, I just saw something weird, sending you a screenshot. And that's where it starts, because in that sense, I want to challenge the technology, because I do not think that we can replace the human element, because by now, all of us, we breathe and read, and we know the other side. And that's the only reason why we actually can catch them red-handed, because we know exactly where to look. We know exactly where they will fall. And Eitan said something interesting, the Arabs, I don't know, maybe the Arabs or whatever, the non-Western world, they view social media differently. But it's not only that, the cultural codes are different. We see, for example, that Palestinian NGOs, most of us think that they're just corrupt, right? And they will take money from anyone. That's not necessarily true, because when the European Union introduces a new condition in their contracts with NGOs around the world, it was not particularly for Palestinian NGOs, and they called it an anti-terror condition. It was only the Palestinian NGOs that absolutely, on a level of principle, refused to sign it. Now, to your mind, you would think, what do they care? They signed something, you take the money, the EU is not checking them anyways. We know that for a fact, but they absolutely refuse to sign. So it is that human element, that all of us knowing where they're going to fall and how and why and where we can catch them, is absolutely irreplaceable. And the technology, we rely on it to do things quicker, greater volume, and then also share it more virally with a broader audience.
And you touched on this just now, but it's something I was going to mention, because I was surprised Gil didn't say it. But I know from Gil, when he came and talked to Los Angeles, he spoke, a bunch of people I know heard him, and he actually gave a very practical tip, which you can mention here, which is, Gil, what do you invite people to do when they ask you a very simple question, you'll know where I'm getting at. They say, hey, Gil, we should cancel our New York Times subscriptions, right? You know where I'm going with this now, right? So why don't you give your little drush about what you think people should do about their bad newspapers, because it's actually an actionable piece of advice you give, isn't it?
Boaz, I wish the questions were so easy when I get interviewed on the BBC. You know, thank you for the softball. In LA, they're good at baseball. Yes, you should not cancel your subscription to the New York Times, the LA Times, and other media outlets. We need you, educated consumers, the kind of people who would watch a 2-hour podcast about Israel, who care enough. We need you to be the educated news consumers who need to be closely monitoring what you read. I lead a very small staff in Jerusalem. There's only 3 writers, 3 people now in social media, 2.5. And we rely on people around the world to constantly send information to action@honestreporting.com whenever they find egregious reporting facts that are wrong in media outlets around the world. We at Honest Reporting have an education project that is getting into high gear that will be helping educate the news consumers if we're not going to be able to change the media, and the trend of the media reporting faster without checking their facts is only going to get worse in the days of SEO. We need more than ever the army that's very small, people around the world who are pro-Israel and care. If they need to be fighting on social media, and if they're not big enough on social media, then we'll magnify it and we'll make sure the truth gets out there.
So actionable advice here, to reiterate, we've got the idea of don't cancel your subscriptions to these papers that we know are biased in the left and right. Read them and actually send them to good agencies like yours to actually find them so that we can make differences. As David said, be skeptical, read things with skepticism and with knowledge that these are humans behind it. If you're not going to do all the fact checking yourself, at least read them with a very skeptical, if not cynical eye, so you realize that that's not the be all and end all. Try not to use Google Translate, try to use AI technology, maybe even tell it to use its own AI to translate things so that we can go to the actual sources, and just be somebody who is going to be constantly looking for this data yourself. Because I would even say, if you're not willing to be somebody who's going to take action and try to actually critically think, I would say the next piece of advice is then just stop reading the news. I would just be like, do one or the other. If you say too much and it's out of my capacity and I can't handle doing what it takes to get to the truth and I'm going to believe whatever it is, well, then I would say option B is then just start watching funny dog videos, because if you're going to do it right. But I know that's too much to ask. And by the way, yes, the type of people who will watch a 2-hour video, as Gil said, are the types of people you want sending you things. But the majority of people who watch this are going to inevitably be the people who watch the reels on Instagram, because that's the way of the world now. But the good news is you can rely on me not to fuck up the videos and missay what you say and suddenly put a video of, you know, people screaming that are from 10 years ago and say that it's from now. I want to start getting to specific questions that people have asked, because there are endless things that I have here that people want to know about. And I knew this question would be, I mean, I could have told you guys to give me 4 hours and we wouldn't have had enough time. So we're going to go through as much as we can before people have to start to go. Now, mentioned the BBC just came up casually. And so there was a specific question from a specific person towards David. Most, if not all of you, probably follow or know Khaled Hassan, who does a lot of work online. He wanted to know from David, why do you believe that the BBC has the amount of Israel-related bias that it appears to have, which is a generous way to put it? And I wish I had Cheyenne on here, because he's their actual fact checker and he's phenomenal. And props to him. So we have.
Yeah, Cheyenne's good. He, unfortunately, I mean, he's head of he's part of BBC Verify. I don't actually think BBC should be verifying anything in the way they are. And he's kind of fighting a pretty much lost cause. I believe. I think he's up against it.
By the way,
look, I think
just a quick interjection. Cheyenne wanted to join this. he took, and we took an extra 2 weeks to get this date going. Cheyenne really wanted to join this.
Yeah, yeah.
BBC did not give him permission. That's what it came down to.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. Look, I think there are two key issues, and both of them are relevant, not just with the BBC. The first issue is related to, I mean, it is related to a changing demographic in Europe. And it's related to the fact that the BBC, and it stretches beyond organisations like the BBC. We can also look at Amnesty, if we want to talk about NGO Monitor, where they start employing people who have sketchy pasts, shall we say. Or in the BBC's case, ex-Al Jazeera journos would be a good one. And they're not just at the BBC, they're everywhere. The fact that Western media outlets consider Al Jazeera to be a decent recruiting pool is beyond belief. And what happens, it creates a mindset within these organizations, and they're now part of the editorial teams. And then, every time they're sitting around a table somewhere discussing Israel, there's going to be this kind of input taking place into the discussion, not just at the BBC, it's at Sky, it's at The Guardian, it's probably everywhere. So that's one problem. Adding to that, we also obviously, because of the changing demographic, and again, this is not, we have the issue that media sources try to diversify their workforce, so it's a deliberately proactive engagement, which again increases the problem. But the second issue that the BBC have, and this again goes across the board. Now, the BBC, and Gil can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they have a single office in Jerusalem. And I think in that single office in Jerusalem sits everybody, which means BBC, BBC World, BBC Persia, BBC Arabic. They all sit in that single office. So imagine you are a new BBC journalist. You've never been to Israel before. You're a new and you've got really, goodwill. I don't actually, as I said, I'm a bit of a cynic, and I'm very much a pessimist. I think we make a mistake when we believe the other side has any goodwill at all. But let's just pretend that you're a BBC journalist, you're going off to Jerusalem for the first time, all the goodwill in the world, you want to do a proper, unbiased job. You get there, you don't speak Hebrew, you don't speak Arabic, okay? Your history of the region is a bit shaky. The first thing they're going to do is give you a black book. You're finished before you've even sat down in the chair for the first day, because who you speak to, who your runners are, who your fixers are, who's holding your hand, who's taking you around, all of this is dictated to you. Now, because most of the news that is coming out of Israel is coming out either of the West Bank or Gaza, the most important language is going to be Arabic. And this is way that the BBC News is so brilliantly skewed. Because you, as an English speaker, you're sitting there and you're saying, right, I need to find out what's going on in Gaza today. Who can I talk to? Well, the people that are going to direct you are the BBC Arabic staff. And it's done. The deal is done. And those BBC Arabic staff are going to contact their mates in Gaza, who they've been working with for the last 20 years. Those mates work for Hamas or Islamic Jihad or whatever else they are. And there's your problem. So I'll end now because I can see Eitan wants to come in, but those are your two key issues. And I think it is an unsolvable issue.
So, I mean, if I will show you something just about BBC, I'll tell you something just about BBC, but obviously this is just, an example of a broader issue that, is plaguing all of the mainstream, let's call them corporate media outlets that have people in Gaza. I can send a link if you guys want, but I actually found, you can't even see it, but I posted this on Twitter X a couple of months ago. I can send a link if anyone's interested. The BBC specifically has, they have a guy named Rushdie Abu Aluf, I think his name is, and he's based in Gaza. And he had some reports that contained unbelievably blatant, overt, disgusting misinformation about what's going on in the Gaza Strip. And so I looked into the guy and I found that he met, and this is from a Palestinian website, and you can't see it, but there's a picture and everything, I have the quote here. Okay, I'm going to read you guys a quote. Bear with me here for a second. As part, and again, this is translated with AI. I had it corroborated. This is 98.5% accurate. As part of its ongoing engagement with media institutions and on sidelines of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian journalists, the Government Media Office, Ministry of Information, i.e. Hamas, organized a series of field visits to media institutions operating in the Gaza Strip. A delegation led by Salama Maroof, the Director General of Media Services, and included Mohammed Habib, the Director of Public Relations. Sorry, one second. It's too long. One second. In the ongoing visits, the delegation visited the BBC office in Gaza and met with journalist Rashti Abu al-Aluf. They discussed ways to enhance cooperation between the sides with the goal of improving the conditions of Palestinian journalists and media institutions. In other words, here's Palestinian media with a picture, which I'll send to you guys, openly acknowledging that, you have BBC employed journalists in the Gaza Strip just meeting with Hamas, talking about the conditions of Palestinian journalists. I have no idea what that means. And I don't trust that guy to supply news for the BBC. So, David, you mentioned that at the end of the day, the news is created by people. And so this is an example of a person who's creating the news who probably shouldn't be. And, when you understand his motivations, he can, that explains a lot about the way he's covering, why he's covering.
Well,
The
Eitan,
big-
that particular language always means one thing, because that's how the projects are defined. That's how every peace building initiative, it just means fighting occupation. That means that the BBC journalist is in Gaza talking to Hamas on how they are jointly going to more effectively fight the occupation. It always means the same thing.
Just one interesting point that's worth mentioning on those two. I mean, Rushdie is actually no longer in Gaza. He was shipped out, I think, back in December. He was sent to Turkey, and a second one of the team was actually sent out to Qatar. I mean, no, it's not fact checking. But
thank you.
When they turn around these days and they say, well, if only we had people in the Gaza Strip, we would be able to report more accurately. It's always worth reminding them they did have people there. They chose to ship them out.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Douglas Murray, who has his own bias, but he's certainly very entertaining and very thankfully on our side. I've heard him in interviews, and when they say, well, what about what this person is saying for ABC and what this person is saying, and they give all these different corroborating news ones from mainstream, and he says, find me a single one of those reports where it's coming from somebody who's actually in Gaza. That's not just simply getting it fed to them by somebody who they're not even there with, who's telling them directly from Hamas or whatever in Gaza. Like, literally none of them are on the ground.
But there's something more to that, it's there's one thing that whether it's journalists or diplomats are, Gil spoke about the flawed system, right? It's the same with diplomats. Diplomats come, they spend a few years in a place, they start learning a little bit the culture, the background, the language, and the people, right? And then they get shipped off to the next destination. But there's more to it. There's like we always talk about Israel being judged on double standards, right? That they expect us to uphold to certain moral standards that no one else in the world is supposed to. But when it comes to Arabs, there is an incredible amount of an apologetic approach and even romanticization, right? So they hate the Jews a little bit, it's like it's part of the culture, the folklore. So they incite to violence a bit. So, it's okay as long as we build sustainable development, I don't know how many of you might remember this, because this was a few years back, way before October the 7th. We unearthed a story of an aid worker, a German aid worker who was based in Jordan. She was working for one of the biggest, it is a German funded, but one of the biggest international aid organizations with, I think, 40,000 employees around the world, or some crazy number like that. And she was based in Jordan, and this was around the Manal Tamimi story, right? And there was a discussion on social media, on Facebook, of employees, but not on their personal accounts and not during work time, right? And they were like going back and forth, and obviously all the local stuff was glorifying Manal and, you know, telling how Israel is horrible and the Zionist entity and so on. And this German aid worker didn't even say something pro-Israeli. She just said, well, how would your army, you know, German army or Jordanian army react if a 16-year-old girl keeps coming and throwing stones at her? Like, you know, they come once, she comes twice, whatever. She just said it wasn't a one-off situation, but you know, there's a soldier and there's a situation, and I think that in any one of our countries, the army would not react differently. She got completely ostracized, obviously, in that session, but more than that, the local staff, the Jordanian staff, screenshot the conversations and took it to her employer. And very conveniently, after over a decade of working for the organization, her contract was not renewed. She wasn't fired, but her contract was not renewed. And in a conversation with her, they elaborated and they said that she offended the local staff by addressing something that is a very sensitive issue. I mean, which means that a German boss of hers, instead of saying, this is a political conversation that should not even take place. This is the worst case scenario, is to call it a political conversation. Some of the posts of the local staff were blatantly anti-Semitic, so he could have taken it in that direction, but he didn't do any of that. He accused her of offending the local staff. Now, to fast forward the story, we took her to the Israeli media and exposed the story, and consequently we researched the staff. We found a lot of you know, talking about investigative and fact-checking processes. We mapped their social media history and showed their true colors and went to the media, and following that, a bunch of them were actually fired or suspended and so on. She got a nice paycheck from the organization, but it's just and I see this across the board. There's a higher standard to which we are you know, expected to live up to, and then there's almost no standard that the Palestinian or the Arab side is supposed to you know, uphold to, because like they can say just about anything and it's going to be looked at like, oh well, you know, just a little bit of hate. So it's a tough game.
You assume that it's true when they say it, and even if it's proven that it's not true, as we've said, it kind of hardly matters. Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. Roz Rothstein, who you probably all know, the head of Stand With Us, she texted me last night. She wants to know, I'm going to throw out a few of these things at once. What are your thoughts about what the morning after might look like? Okay, and you know what I mean by the morning after. I'm not talking about Plan B, abortion pill. I'm also, she also wanted to specifically know, why do you think, where did I have it? Right over here. Why do you think there's sympathy on American campuses with Hamas, even though they're listed as a US terrorist group, raping, torturing, and murdering people? And do you actually think Hamas is ever going to actually give up our hostages? Those are the three ones that I want to highlight that she said. Any one of you want to jump in and give me brief answers as we can to it? These are big questions.
All right.
I'll go with the day after, if that's okay with you, because that's something that we are heavily involved with and we've been working on. We just launched a couple of months ago, released a policy paper with very practical recommendations for policymakers around the world on how to condition humanitarian aid to Gaza and West Bank and East Jerusalem in the post-war reality, which is the day after. And we keep insisting, and we will continue raising awareness both in Israel, because that's no less of a market, and around the world, that part of the conversation of what Gaza and the rest of the Palestinian society looks like the day after is not only who's going to administer it physically, whether, to what extent the Israeli government and army will be involved, what are going to be the safeguards, what's going to be the role of the international community, the Abraham Accord countries, and so on and so on. The humanitarian aid must be part of that conversation, because a conservative estimate is that since the Oslo Accords, the international community, which is basically 30 DAC, according to OECD developed countries, have funneled around $40 billion in humanitarian aid to Palestinians. And that is a conservative estimate. And most of it was diverted to support terror. Now, when we say that, we typically think to, physically support terror, to build tunnels or rockets or abuse the humanitarian infrastructure. But part of that went to support terror politically, which is either to romanticize Hamas, and give it political legitimacy, or to further erode the legitimacy of Israel and every other institution. And if we don't change the paradigm on how the international community provides that humanitarian aid the day after, not only will we go back to the business as usual, but there will be that much more hate, because just like for us, October the 7th is the greatest pogrom since the Holocaust. For them, it's the new Nakba, right? So everything that happened after. So we've been presenting this in parliaments around the world, and we believe that will be one of the crucial or should be one of the crucial elements of the discussions of the day after.
I want to actually get a question in from Brian Fischbach, who's a really amazing writer and behind the scenes over at the Jewish Journal. Well, you answered his question about your process. We did that early on. Was there a time that either of you guys at organizations, which really is mostly here would be Olga and Gil, was there a time that you had to call out one of your own colleagues for using misleading language?
You mean swearing?
No, in terms of misleading, in terms of the same thing you look for with other places, but realizing that your own people needed to sort of like follow the same sort of guidelines, or has that not been an issue?
I have to constantly take up British copy, translate from British English into American English. No, I lead a wonderful team of investigative journalists, and thank God we haven't made a mistake in a long time, and we know that we're being watched as a watchdog, so we have to be very careful.
All right, well, here's something very specific that you can answer yes or no to. What he would like to know is, and I'm sure a lot of people would like this, what sites or services do you pay to subscribe to for in-depth research that would be great for other people who want to do research?
Meltwater is a tool. It's like Google on steroids.
Mouthwater.
Meltwater, Meltwater.
Meltwater, thank you. Okay, great. Olga, is there one that you guys use that we should know about, or not specific?
The thing is that we just, all our information is based on open source information, which people joke about this when I say, and some accuse me of downplaying what we do. I just, we open source is just a fancy word for Google it, man. Like, go see who are the people, who are the sources, who are the organizations, and do basic due diligence, including social media, right? You want to know who are the people that are being quoted. And to us, basically, it's less we were approached many times to use softwares and search engines and all kinds of technological solutions. But we've realized that it's the insisting on the fact that when we sit in front of elected officials or journalists and say, and we are able to say, if I can Google it, then you should be able to Google it too, is one of the most powerful arguments that we can come up with. And then obviously the human element that I spoke earlier about, because we don't do it randomly. We by now know what to expect, whom to follow. There's we call it revolving doors. Individuals will leave one anti-Israel organization and get a job with another one, but they will take their activities and ideas there as well. One of the employees of Meta who was involved in evaluating content actually used to work for Human Rights Watch, so you can imagine what that looked like. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge that cannot be replaced by any software or any search engine, of understanding the playfield, the playground, and the history, and how organizations and individuals interconnect. The other side has an incredible network. I don't know, I guess that they fight too, but at least to us, it looks like they have an even greater level of collaboration than we do. And I think I understand why, because they have one simple goal, and that is to, delegitimize us. It's much easier to define it than for us to, rally behind one idea. So yeah, we're less about fancy softwares. It's more about how painful it is for us, for example, to lose an employee who's been with us for years, because it's almost impossible to document that institutional knowledge that rests with every individual, because you can imagine that we will have a researcher it's a matter of personal interest and passion. So this person's passion is these type of organizations or these type of topics, and then this person's passion is something else. But when all of it comes together and is combined is when we create what we call magic, right? And then when a person like that leaves, then a lot of that is very difficult to replace or to cover the gap.
I don't know if you follow, but there's a journalist that I correspond with named Pamela Peresky, and she asked me a question. She asked me if the one I'm going to ask is, how can all of the disparate Jewish groups more effectively collaborate or accelerate each other's work? I think that would be very nice to watch, because I'm sure many people who are interested in watching this do work with or on boards of these Jewish groups. So there's obviously no animosity between the groups that I see here on this chat, but for the countless others, would somebody like to chime in for this idea?
Well, firstly, I think each nation has its own, network. I think the American scene is very different from the English scene. I mean, all I can do is I'll give you an experience I had when I was a few years ago. I was called in to help and I'm not going to name names because I don't want to, it's not my thing. I was called in to help a project that they wanted to do that used my skill set, which was, I was undercover at the time. Nobody out on the outside knew who I was, and they wanted to help work on this project. And then I was called in by a second organization, basically to do exactly the same thing. And then I was called in by a third organization, and again, it was to do exactly the same thing. So I had 3 London-based organizations, and there aren't that many London-based organizations, all using resources and money to do exactly the same project. I think there is a lot of room for negotiating. Look, we're outnumbered as it is. We're greatly outnumbered. We have limited amount of resources. Every single soldier, and this is a battlefield, every single soldier is important. Every single soldier, I think it was Olga that mentioned earlier that we should be fighting on every hill effectively, and I agree with that 100%. I think we should be in every room we can be, fighting on every hill. I think we need to be far more economical with the way we resource. I think there's a lot more room for internal communication between the different groups. I get that they're all after the same funding. I get they're all standing on the same platform, and I get, they have to chest beat to show that they're doing as much something, but there is still a war being fought. It's a PR war. We need everybody to be far more communicative and far more cooperative behind the scenes.
All right, give me at least a couple of last questions that I'm trying to squeeze out before any of you potentially tell me you've got to go. Ariel Jalali, who I know at least Shira knows, he's the one that connected me to her, and he himself is quite an expert in the AI space, but he was humble enough to tell me Shira would be better than him, by the way, Shira, in case you didn't know that. He had a bunch of questions. I'm going to ask you one, Shira. How much privacy are we going to have to give up for security? What is our How do we weigh that? Privacy versus security, because that's affecting all of us, whether we want it to or not. My wife and I long ago are of the opinions of, we got data breached with our thing, whatever. We have Alexa, we have our cell phone, we have our computer. If somebody wants my information, they already have it. But at the end of the day, we can't all necessarily take that tone. So what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this is a big issue. This is something that's privacy versus security, even like on the government level, is something that people have been talking about since way before. And that became more popular again with Snowden, with like monitoring, the NSA monitoring different devices. And obviously that still comes into play, and especially like in Israel, that type of security, that type of maneuvering is beneficial to security, because how many terrorist plots have been thwarted through that type of surveillance, we don't even know. But in terms of AI privacy versus security, well, we kind of already, the internet is the training corpus for these existing large language models. So anything on the internet is kind of fair game. We've given up a bit of security. I mean, we've given up a bit of privacy already, just simply by being on social media. But as we progress towards further AI, we're going to need more training data, which means what's being said now on social media is going to come into play. So what I would say is it's less so a matter of privacy and more so a matter of, well, what do you want to convey? What do you want to get out there? And being sure that like we can be a dominant voice if we can try to, as opposed to basically allowing this, the pro-Hamas supporters to be the dominant voice on social media, where that then gets translated into training data for AI models. So I would say it's less so about the privacy that we give up when we put ourselves on the internet, and more so about, well, what do we want to convey on the internet that's going to then become training data?
Okay, I appreciate that, Shira. And nobody better on this chat that could have answered it than you. By the way, I know it's terrible for anybody to ever mention anything about appearances, but I was an art history major. Little known fact, but except for old friends, I was an art history major before I ever figured out I wanted to become a nurse years later, right? Which is years before I did all of this. And I will say, Shira, your appearance with your hair, I cannot help but see you as a painting. It literally, I don't even know what I'm thinking of, but I think I'm thinking of various, I feel like I want to put a halo over your head and you would look like Italian 16th century artwork. So I just want to put that out there. I know it's rule number 1 to talk about a woman's appearance. I've just been canceled in about 14 countries.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
There is a very, very intelligent, actually the first question that was sent to me is by a very old friend. And I'm going to make this our last question here, because it's such an intelligent one. She's an academic, and I'm going to read it to you and see who wants to answer this, and before we say goodbye. The First Amendment here in the United States was written by people who subscribed to the libertarian theory of the press, which basically said that truth was objectively apparent to everyone. So if untruths are printed, people will be able to figure it out on their own. In the 1940s, we saw that this was not true, hence the Hutchins commissions in the 1950s. Today, we have seen this fallacy firsthand. In recent years, we've seen the erosion of trust in the press, the value of truth and facts, the rise of the concept of alternative facts. Yet, we still have no choice but to depend on the news, leaving social media aside for the moment, as it is the only way the rest of us can get information about the outside world, since we can't experience it all ourselves in person. Here comes the question. If people's trust in the news, or at least news that doesn't agree with their worldview, is thoroughly broken, can that trust be fixed? And if so, how? Or have we just gone too far at this point, which I'm assuming David is going to say yes to. And of course, this is a very US specific question, but it's probably very adaptable issue and question to other organizations in other countries. I don't think it's only in the US. So you can see why I might have left this for last. I think it's a highly intelligent question. I really would like to have an answer to it. And I would like to have it from all of you, but I don't think we have time for all of you to answer it. So I'd like to start with Gil, who is out of Israel and is dealing with this on a daily basis.
Maybe I had more optimism before October 7th. You know, I'm a journalist, and I understand through my career that being a journalist has only gotten harder as you've had to work 24 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. And I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. But since October 7th, the farther away we get from that date, more and more disinformation, more and more forgetting what happened on that day gives me a lot less hope, unfortunately, that it can be fixed anytime soon. We need to do a lot better job of explaining Israel's story in order for the world to get the truth. What we've seen people believing around the world in a conflict that's so obviously that we're on the good side and we're fighting evil. And they're uniting against us. It's a lot harder than it's ever been. And because of that, we need organizations like the one and individuals, independent investigative journalists, independent analysts like the ones we have here forever, unfortunately. And we're always going to need us to help people get the truth out there. It's unfortunately something that's going to have to stay. Please go to honestreporting.com, honestreporting.com/subscribe, honestreporting.com/donate, because we're so essential.
I will definitely be sharing all of your organizations and as individuals. Don't you worry about that. So it sounds like everybody does. We're at the very least pushing a massive boulder uphill. The splitting hair difference there is which of you believe we ever can manage to get it successfully up the hill and have our Shabbat rest, versus which of you feel like it's inevitably just going to keep pushing us further and further into the depths. And our technical director who is watching just sent us a link, which I'm guessing if I clicked on would be referring to the art history reference that I made about Shira. So I appreciate that, Patrick. I believe he was sending us some Leonardo da Vinci imagery.
I see it.
I'll look at it. But
if I could just if I could just add something. I know it's getting late for us, but I just to sort of end on a slightly more uplifting note, I'm going to lift us from this gloom. And I'll say that, you said, we're just pushing the boulder uphill in terms of, let's say, like the corporate media, the mainstream legacy media. Maybe we are, and I'm not sure that we need to keep pushing it up the hill. In other words, clearly civilization and society and cultural trends are moving in a direction where, not just when it comes to coverage of Israel and Jews and anti-Semitism and all that stuff, but in general, and pretty much every facet of life that's covered by the media, there are problems with trust that are arising. And I'm not sure those can be rectified, and I'm not sure we should even really try, because, we have, with all the disinformation and all the misinformation and all the whatever that, social media brings, it also brings with it the ability for people like David, who does investigative work, and obviously the organizations, but also individuals. It gives us the power to parse through the BS, to use Olga's language, to parse through the BS and find the facts. And there are also obviously, independent, not just analysts and investigative journalists, but there are independent reporters that do phenomenal work out there. And with time, the more that you sort of like, ensconce yourself in that sort of independent media space, not the weird fringy Iranian Russian-backed whatever's, like the Gray Zone or Mint Press News or whatever, but the more you ensconce yourself in independent media, you really can start to develop sort of like an instinct, an intuition, a muscle for what the news actually is. And with enough time and practice, you can get to some level of truth. And so I think that that's where people, if they're really jaded with the way that corporate media is going, I think that that's what I would recommend. I would say, it requires a lot more work because you have to go find the people that, are doing good work, and not just have it spoon fed to you by the algorithms, by Google or whatever. But you can eventually find, someone that puts out good news and trust them, I think.
I'd like to echo that if I can with 1.5 sentences. I think we already won, and this is despite October the 7th. We have a state, we have a country. Yes, we were attacked and it was horrible, but we're not going anywhere. So, and I also think that the trends that we've been discussing tonight are global. They're not reserved only for reporting on Israel or reporting on Jews, or I think these are major societal, tectonic movements and changes. And we can fight them because that would be a fighting, like it's like Don Quixote, fighting the windmills, nor should we, because major social changes, as painful as they are to those experiencing them, are not necessarily always a bad thing once the process is over. Because as much as, we keep referring to the old school media as trusted sources, but they were no less political than the media today. It was always the winners writing the history, and it was always, this media outlet aligned to this and media outlet aligned to that. What was different is that none of us would have been able to influence the conversation. And I think that that is a major sort of byproduct of total decentralization of media and reporting and governance in general, because the distrust in media is accompanied or maybe predated by a trend of distrusting governments, right? All the traditional authorities, we question everything, and everything comes with pros and cons. But we just need to keep multiplying voices like this and organizations like ours who can fill in those gaps and voice our opinions and shout, right? And actually, if this session would have been only about the impacts that all of us have had in the last 5 years, I think that the session would have had a much more positive note. Because to me, and this is probably the biggest joke that runs at NGO Monitor. Every time we have a win, we sit down, we make a cup of coffee, and they say, like, I can't believe we did this. We're just a few people, like a small office in Jerusalem, and it didn't even take that much, right? It just took taking the right information, placing it in the right moment, in the right setup, and then the rest just like falls like a pyramid of cards usually. To me, I'm optimistic. I'm very critical. I am a cynic, as David says, but I'm not depressed. I love I love the feeling of getting to work in the morning and knowing that I can make a difference.
I think
I don't think my parents had that privilege.
No, I think it's beautiful, and it's a beautiful note for us to finish on. I think it's the idea that both NGO Monitor and Honest Reporting say, give us information so we can help make the world a more accurate place to the best of our ability, and we see actionable differences. And we see Shira, who decides to not enter one of the greatest schools in the world because she wants to actually make an impact and a difference now, and helping create and shape AI technology that we don't even know all the ripple effects are going to come from. We have somebody like David, who just looks into the names that he sees and then goes into the depths of hell, like Hieronymus Bosch, to go back to my art history background, and ends up seeing and ends up learning about things that actually expose them into the light. And then you have somebody like Eitan, who's just bored in bed and can't sleep and scrolls through his phone. And as a result, we now have entire nations in the world that are not going to fund UNRWA as a result. And it's just amazing. And my hat, my kippa is off to you. It's really impressive. And I appreciate all of your time. And I really would have loved to have now asked all of you more questions, including what your next big projects are and so on. But I want to be fair to people whose bladders are exploding and batteries are dying and eyes are slowly closing. So thank you all very, very much for your time today, truly. I really enjoyed this thoroughly. I wouldn't have asked you otherwise. I'm not paid for this, so why would I do it if I didn't enjoy it? So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
so much
Boaz.
for having us.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Chosen Links. If you like what you heard, feel free to share this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on our socials at Boaz Heppner on X and Facebook and at Heppner.Boaz on Instagram.